Hello everyone, my name is Eric Masowski, and in this tutorial we're just going to build a couple of reference plates in 3D Studio Max to display the photographs that we've been modifying in Photoshop. Now this concept, of the reference plates and similar methods can be done in just about any package out there, so feel free to use the package of choice. However, future tutorials in here are going to be using Max, so if you have Max at your disposal, I highly recommend using it. Okay, so let's get started. Let's first go over to the Create tab on the right side of the screen, Geometry, and then down to Plane. What we're going to do is we're going to create a plane that will hold the front view of our guy. So we're just going to click and drag in the front viewport and roughly get the proportions correct. Now if you were going to be doing this for a project, you would end up setting up your units ahead of time and making this to scale. For our purposes, we're just going to build it and then scale it down after the fact. Okay, so once we have our plane selected, we're going to move over to the Modify panel. Modify panel looks like the little blue macaroni noodle at the top of the screen. Within here, on the lower right hand side, we're going to change the length and width segments down to 1. We're basically just getting rid of extra geometry that we don't need. Alright, now at this point what we're going to do is we're going to position our plane to where we need it. If you look in the top viewport, you'll notice that it created our plane right at the 0 mark, or the 0x amount. What we need to do is we need to position it so that it will always be behind whatever we're modeling. So if we switch over to the top viewport, you can switch views by right-clicking in the viewport. Click and drag the plane to the side. Your move tool is up here at the top of the screen. Just click and drag on the box to move it over. So we're going to bring it back a little bit and over to the left. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to create a material that will hold the photos that we've been working on. So to do that, we first open up our material editor by pressing M on the keyboard. And then within here, we already have a material selected. We need to assign our image to the diffuse channel. So we can do that by clicking on the little blank box to the right of diffuse. Once we do so, it brings up a list of all the different types of maps that we can apply to that channel. In this case, we just want bitmap, which basically means a rasterized image. Click OK. Brings up a file picker, and we want to choose the topology PSD file. Now if we take a look at it, we can see the image that we need. It has our topology defined, as well as our guidelines for the front and side views. Okay, so we click Open. Now since this is a Photoshop file, or PSD file, we can choose to either collapse all the layers and just use all of them as a whole, or we can go down to individual layer and choose a particular layer that we want to import. Now since we're interested in all the information, we're going to use collapsed layers. Click OK. At this point, it ends up adding the image to our material. We can now click and drag this onto our plane. Now you'll notice that it doesn't show up on our plane in our viewports. This is default behavior for Max. What we have to do is we have to tell Max that we want to see this texture in our viewport. So we do that with the blue and white checkered box in our material editor. When we click on that, we see our texture on our image. Now, you may notice that it severely squashed our image. It basically took our image and tried to fit it to our plane. Now that's not what we want. We want to try to maintain the same aspect ratio of our original image so that when we model, our guy will be to scale and he won't be squashed in one particular direction. So, to do this, we're going to need to modify the texture coordinates of this plane. So in your Modify panel, click on the little drop-down list and scroll all the way to the bottom. Once there, choose UVW Map. This will now allow us to modify the texture coordinates for this plane. Now we could, if we wanted to, just decrease the U tile amount to get it roughly where we need. But this isn't very precise. We may end up making him wider or thinner than he actually is. So we're going to use a tool called Bitmap Fit. Now if you're new to Max, notice that when I move my cursor over in an empty space over here on the right, you get a little hand. You can now click and drag to expose more options. There's also this little scroll bar to the right of it. So scroll down to the bottom and choose Bitmap Fit. Pick the image that we use for our material, click Open, and collapse layers again. And you'll notice it now keeps the aspect ratio of the original image. Unfortunately, in this case, it crops off parts of the image because our plane isn't wide enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to reposition the texture on this plane so that we see the interesting information. So on the right hand side, right underneath the drop-down list, you'll see it says UV mapping. This is just the modifier that we applied to our plane. If we click on the little plus sign and go to Gizmo, this allows us to freely move, rotate, or scale the image as it is applied to our plane. So all we want to do is we want to use the Move tool and click on the x-axis and drag it to the side. We want to try to center the guy in the middle of the plane. Okay, so that's pretty good. Click on Gizmo again to get out of that mode. And we have a pretty good reference plane there. Now you may notice that as you rotate it around, it gets darker. What we want is we're going to be looking at our object from all kinds of angles. And so we want to make sure that we can still see the reference plane clearly behind our object. So if we go back to our material editor, now materials in Max are hierarchical, just a very simple tree structure. So when you assign a map, you're kind of assigning a child to the top layer, which holds the general color information, transparencies, and shininess information. So right now we're at our map level, or the child. So we basically need to go up one level, or go to parent. So this brings us back to where we started. If we need to get back to the bitmap, we can just click on the little M and go back and forth. Now, to get this to show up properly or to behave how we want it, what we need to do is we need to remove lighting from its calculations. And we do that by completely self-illuminating the material. So now, when we rotate, it keeps the same intensity. So just set self-illumination to 100. Okay, we no longer need the material editor at this point, so we can close it down and get some of our screen real estate back. Okay, so now let's do the same for the side. I'm going to use this as an exercise for yourself to set it up on your own and see if you can. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to copy our existing object. So we don't have to go ahead and create a new plane and go through that whole process again. We're just going to use what we have here and then tweak it to modify or to show the left side. So we're going to switch to our rotate tool, And in our perspective view, you see our little rotation gizmo. If we hold down Shift and click and drag on this one axis, the blue ring, you can see that it makes a copy of it. So what we want to do is we want to copy it to 90 degrees exactly. So there we go. If you're having difficulty getting it to exactly 90, you can press A on the keyboard. What this does is it turns on angle snap, which will basically rotate your object in increments of 5. Okay, so when the dialog box comes up, we want to create a copy. And we can now move this to its new location. Now try setting up the left view, or the left plane here. Okay, now when you're setting this up, you may realize a couple things. One, the guy is facing the wrong direction, and two, our plane isn't big enough to hold the entire profile image. So let's take each of those in turn. First, we can flip the image just by choosing flip next to UV tile. Again, we can position it so now he's facing the right way, or namely the same way as our front image. Now we need to add a little bit more space to the left and to the right. Now one of the really powerful things about 3D Studio Max and its modifier setup is we can jump back down to plane, and we have access to all the original information that we used to create this plane at the beginning. So if we click on plane and increase the width to however much we need, you notice that it keeps the texture coordinates because that happens above this level. So we can now jump back to UV mapping, click on Gizmo, and adjust it a little bit further. Okay, so now we have two reference planes nicely positioned and so on. Okay, now what sometimes happens when you have reference planes that are actual objects in your scene is you accidentally select them while modeling. We're going to handle that right now. So if we select one of our reference planes, right click and go to freeze selection. Right now we can't select it, but that really doesn't do us much good because we can't even see the image, so it's completely useless. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify the behavior of frozen objects. So let's right click, go to unfreeze all, select our object again by left clicking on it, then right click and go to properties. Now within properties there are two controls that we need to use. First we need to freeze our object. Then further down on the left hand side it says show frozen in gray. And when this is activated, that gives us the boring gray color that we saw before. If we uncheck it, it tries to preserve the appearance of the object. So if we click OK, you can see I can no longer select this object, but it looks the same. So now let's do the same process to the profile view. So we first select it with the left mouse button, right click to bring up the quad menu, go down to properties, choose freeze at the top, and then uncheck show frozen in gray. Click OK. So there we go. We can no longer select these objects and we can freely model from here. Okay, that'll do it for this part. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or post on the forums. Thank you.